In 1931, thousands of tenants in Barcelona and nearby areas stopped paying rent and joined a rent strike that challenged landlords and the government of the Spanish Republic that protected them. This is one of the many labor struggles you don't learn about in a school. However, in these times of rising rents, shared apartments out of necessity, or being kicked off your rental home in the summer so your place can become an Airbnb for tourists, this story offers valuable lessons for the current housing crisis in Spain and elsewhere. I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and in this episode I will explain the origins and development of the 1931 Barcelona rent strike and its consequences and legacy. First of all, I want to make it clear that throughout history there have been numerous tenants strikes with varying success. In Argentina in 1907, Chile in 1915, Mexico City in 1922, several in New York, and since 2023 there has been one in Toronto, Canada. Back in 1919, the anarcho-syndicalist union CNT had formed the Barcelona Tenants Defense Union, which demanded better housing and a 50% reduction in rents. This was the same demand successfully made by the Chileans a few years earlier, and in 1922 they held a rent strike in Barcelona. However, the strike I will talk about today has been the most important in the history of Spain to date, and it happened in the northeastern region of Catalonia. I discussed Barcelona's housing crisis in the 1920s and 30s in a separate video to avoid making this one even longer. So subscribe to not miss my content, and I will leave a link to that episode, which is just a few minutes long, in the description. But here is the summary for the context of the rent strike. Barcelona had grown significantly, reaching a population of over 1 million, with many migrants from other parts of Spain. Almost all workers were tenants. They were unable to buy homes. And rents skyrocketed in the 1920s, taking up 40% of workers' wages, much like today. Many people shared apartments with other families, and worker apartments often had deplorable sanitary conditions. Those who couldn't afford an apartment ended up spending the night in shelters, shanties, or on the street. About 30,000 people lived like this, while before the Civil War there were about 40,000 vacant apartments. So there wasn't a housing shortage, but a lack of housing on the market. Public housing was virtually non-existent, and neighborhoods were sharply divided between working class and bourgeois areas, and between mainly Catalan and non-Catalan areas. That said, in October 1930, the rent boycott began in Barceloneta, a poor and working-class neighborhood home to La Maquinista, the city's largest metalworking company. It soon spread to state-owned cheap houses on the outskirts, shanty areas, and parts of Sants, which back then was a working-class neighborhood with many factories. The tenants' strike was a non-violent protest against the high cost of living for poorly paid, unskilled, and especially unemployed workers. Neighborhood associations, not the CNT, started this boycott. However, it was the CNT's Construction Workers Union that gave the strike a very significant boost. This is unsurprising, considering that 40% of its 30,000 members were unemployed after the works for the 1929 International Exposition ended, and that anarchists promote direct and coordinated action by workers against their political and economic oppressors. On April 12, 1931, the same day as the municipal elections that will bring about the Second Spanish Republic, a construction worker anarchist proposed creating the Economic Defense Commission, or CDE for short, to study how workers spend their wages and how much went to rent. For the May Day celebrations, the CNT of Barcelona organized a rally and open assembly in front of the Palace of Fine Arts, with the slogan "May 1st against unemployment, inflation, and for rent reductions." The event attracted about 100,000 people according to the anarchist newspaper Solidaridad Obrera, reaching 150,000 when they moved towards Plaza Sant Jaume, the seat of the Catalan government, to deliver their demands to the president. It should be noted that the rent strike was linked to the expectations created by the Republicans before and shortly after proclaiming the Republic, by promising rent price caps. By the way, just to be clear, when I say Republicans in this episode, I mean supporters of the Republic instead of a monarchy, not the Republican Party in the US. Once the center-left party Esquerra took power in Catalonia, tenants reminded them of their promises and insisted that their strike had no revolutionary intentions to abolish landlord-tenant relations. In the assembly, they agreed to reduce working-class rents by 40%, stop the work of religious congregations due to unfair competition, and that each employer should hire unemployed workers up to 15% of their current workforce. Thus, housing demands were mixed with actions against unemployment. The newspaper Solidaridad Obrera detailed the proposal throughout May. The commission explained that landlords exploited the housing crisis to increase their profits. They identified landlords as one of the causes of the stagnation of the Spanish economy, because a large portion of workers' wages went into the pockets of these unproductive rentiers. The tenants' struggle challenged the idea that speculators, landlords, and governments had of viewing housing as a means to profit rather than a basic need. Solidaridad Obrera encouraged tenants who couldn't make ends meet not to pay rent, called for rent exemptions for the unemployed, and denounced the high prices and unsanitary conditions of working-class housing. The Economic Defense Commission expanded the strike by organizing open and democratic assemblies in working-class neighborhoods in Barcelona and nearby towns. Many women participated in these CDE assemblies because male workers often handed their wages to their wives, making women heavily involved in other consumer-related protests, like those against food shortages. The movement was especially strong in areas like El Raval, then popularly known as Barrio Chino, Barceloneta, Sants, Clot, Poblenou, the cheap houses on Barcelona's outskirts, and in nearby towns like Santa Coloma de Gramenet and La Torrassa in Hospitalet de Llobregat. The rent strike even reached towns kilometers away from Barcelona, like Calella and Vilanova i la Geltrú. Individually, the unemployed and poorly paid workers were weak, but together, under the umbrella of the CDE and by extension the CNT, they formed a strong and effective movement. The CDE welcomed many non-unionized workers and only asked tenants and strikers to register with the Commission and act in solidarity. Due to the decentralized, self-managed anarchist way of organization, the rent strike included specific demands from each neighborhood. Some tenants wanted better housing conditions, while those in the public cheap houses demanded schools, medical centers, street lighting, and transport. The unemployed requested free public transport to help with job searches, while the Horta Neighborhood Assembly had more radical demands, like closing the local church or removing the Spanish Gendarmerie Force, the Civil Guard, from their district. Thanks to this experience in the tenants' strike, many workers experienced for the first time what it meant to have a voice in democratic assemblies, and thus felt empowered by the tactics of collective and direct action. A strong sense of class solidarity was created, connecting the various working-class neighborhoods of Barcelona because they all experienced more or less similar problems. When landlords ordered the power and water to be cut off in striking homes, workers simply reconnected them. When an eviction occurred, the strikers and neighbors, even from other neighborhoods, responded by helping reoccupy the evicted apartment and put the furniture back in place, as the police did not have enough officers to maintain surveillance. If immediate reoccupation was impossible, there was always someone willing to offer temporary accommodation, as was already common among CNT militants. Illegal reoccupations and reinstalling the evicted became common practices of a movement that declared they were willing to do anything rather than sleep on the street. And these successes only gave more confidence and strength to the strikers. During protests against eviction attempts in one of the cheap houses areas, authorities had to send a civil guard truck to prevent the local church from being burned down, as it was seen as a symbol of oppression. There were so many lynching attempts on bailiffs that they sometimes refused to carry out evictions. Violent clashes between the police and neighbors were common, but when women and children were involved, the police often didn't know how to act and abandoned their attempt to carry out an eviction. Other tactics included marching to the landlord's home and threatening them, sometimes at gunpoint, to stop eviction attempts. Solidaridad Obrera even published the names and addresses of those opposed to the rent strike. The work done by neighborhood assemblies culminated in a massive rally on July 5th, again at the Palace of Fine Arts. They reiterated demands for a 40% rent reduction, that the deposit for new tenants should count as the first month's rent, and that the unemployed should not pay rent. If landlords refuse to accept these demands, tenants will pay nothing, and warned that they were doing so under the initiative of the Economic Defense Commission of the CNT. Their demands spread quickly thanks to assemblies and events, leaflets distributed in working-class neighborhoods, and tenants' actions. It's hard to estimate how many participated in the rent strike because after the July 1936 coup failed in Catalonia, revolutionaries burned municipal court archives. The CD reported 45,000 strikers in July and claimed the rent strike reached a peak of 100,000 tenants in August. These figures are believable given the extreme reaction from authorities and landlords, as we will see soon. The widespread participation in the rent strike is easy to understand because, unlike a labor strike where workers sacrifice their wages during the strike, the benefit of not paying rent is immediate. Time was on the tenant side, and even if landlords didn't accept their demands, not paying rent for a few months was something that proletarian pockets will appreciate. However, things soon took a turn for the worse. The official Chamber of Urban Property of Barcelona, or COPAP for short, reacted quickly. At their large meeting on July 20th, landlords were very alarmed. They spoke about the great suffering of small property owners due to taxes and now the strike. They demanded legal protection, claiming that these disruptive tenants were breaking the harmony between owners and tenants. They believed the rent strike aimed to attack the always sacred private property, harm the national economy, and overthrow the Second Spanish Republic to establish a Bolshevik dictatorship. The COPAP asked the civil governor of Barcelona and the central government to harshly repress the strikers, ban their propaganda activities, outlaw the Economic Defense Commission, and arrest the main leaders. They said this was necessary to maintain social order and the principle of authority and for the good of respectable tenants, meaning those who never complain and accept anything. The landlord's reaction was not to consider possible solutions to the housing problem or to negotiate anything, but to see it as a criminal campaign and a violation of private property, therefore considering it a police problem that should be dealt with through repression. The Property Owners' Chamber threatened to withhold tax payments and used the influence of their former president, Piqui Pont, leader of the right-wing Radical Republican Party in Barcelona, to pressure the central government to act. With the tenants' strike and another big ongoing strike from the telecommunications company, the CNT and the Republican government clashed in the streets in the summer of 1931. The right-wing Interior Minister, Miguel Maura, agreed that they couldn't accept negotiations because that would lead to more demands from the strikers, and even suggested illegalizing the CNT, as had been done during Primo de Rivera's dictatorship in the 1920s. Francisco Largo Caballero, the despicable leader of the Socialist Party PSOE and Labour Minister, called the rent strike absurd, and saw it as an opportunity to end the CNT's hegemony in Catalonia. A typical example of a statist socialist or Marxist betraying workers and becoming bourgeois when they enter governments and parliaments. But well, what can you expect from someone who even collaborated with Primo de Rivera's dictatorship? Miguel Maura and the Justice Minister promised the COPAP that they will give instructions to quickly carry out the evictions of strikers, and on July 27th, a prosecutor banned the Economic Defense Commission leaflets as seditious. For their part, the center-left party Esquerra, which governed Catalonia and had promised in the elections to limit rent prices, did nothing to solve the housing crisis. Esquerra could not tolerate the direct actions of the striking tenants because it exposed that their interclassist rhetoric was just that, rhetoric, and that the interests they defended were those of the property-owning classes. This is not surprising, since many Esquerra politicians came from the petty bourgeoisie. Esquerra asked workers for patience, but you can ask that of those who need to improve their situation immediately or else be evicted and end up homeless. It was unreasonable to ask unemployed and poor workers to wait passively for the Republicans to maybe do something at some indefinite future time. The truth is that direct action was pressuring landlords like no law had ever managed. Authorities quickly criminalized the strikers and treated them as enemies of the Republic, reactionaries, agitators, slackers, and criminals posing as unemployed. This revived the old 19th century distinction between dignified and honorable poor, meaning submissive workers who don't complain and obey, and subversive and lazy poor. Instead of acknowledging that there was a severe housing crisis in Barcelona, Republican politicians and the bourgeoisie, who were one and the same, claimed that the strike was the result of the violent practices and coercion of a minority of dangerous agitator tenants. They even spread false information claiming that tenants of public cheap houses were profiting by subletting their apartments while renting luxurious houses on the coast. There were also speeches and policies from the Catalan nationalist party Esquerra discriminating against, criminalizing, and expelling immigrants from southern Spain who had arrived in recent years. But that will be a topic for another episode. It became clear that the Republican authorities were willing to apply the same old policy of police repression, the violence that the powerful love to use to remind everyone who is in charge. The summer of 1931 in Barcelona was marked by an explosion of strikes, up to 41 in total. However, these strikes were not a revolutionary attack against the Republic as some paranoid officials in the central government feared. It was simply about enjoying the freedoms recognized by the Republic and improving the workers' terrible conditions after nearly a lost decade of unionism due to Primo de Rivera's dictatorship. Even the British consul was surprised there weren't more strikes, given how poorly paid the workers were. The Economic Defense Commission was shocked by the ferocity of the state's reaction. They reaffirmed that their demands were realistic and fair, and expressed a willingness to negotiate which was non-existent from the other side. As a counterattack, Solidaridad Obrera began publishing information about landlords' tax fraud in early August, revealing that they typically declared half or less of their rental income. They thought that in a republic, the law will apply equally to everyone. But while the state protected criminal exploiters and fraudsters, it treated those protesting against abuses as criminals. Naturally, the COPAP publicly denied the frauds, but an internal report from the following year confirmed that most landlords made fraudulent tax declarations, even to the property owner's chamber itself, using fake contracts and identities to hide the number of their properties. Legal and tax evasion by landlords was common practice and tolerated by the state, which primarily represented the interests of property owners. All this happened while the COPAP took the Barcelona City Council to court for refusing to pay the special 1% tax established to cover the costs of the 1929 International Exposition, which had left the municipality heavily indebted. This is a typical example of privatizing profits and socializing losses. Due to the pressure from criminal landlords and the Republicans' desire to stabilize the new regime, the government went on the offensive in August when Anguera de Sojo was appointed civil governor of Barcelona. He outlawed the Economic Defense Commission and banned the meetings of striking tenants. Anguera de Sojo demanded that the CNT provide the list of registered strikers, and when they refused, he imposed a hefty fine on the anarcho-syndicalist union. The civil governor ordered the arrest of the most prominent organizers, imprisoning them in La Modelo prison. Thus, in early September, 54 CNT prisoners began a hunger strike, which also sparked a prison riot. And outside the prison, the CNT of Barcelona declared a general strike in solidarity and protest against the repression. About 300,000 workers joined the strike, including those from industrial cities in the province of Barcelona. Anguera de Sojo, with the support of the Republican Socialist government in Madrid, showed no willingness to negotiate and arrested more CNT members. The more radical anarchists wanted to turn it into a revolutionary strike and put armed militias on the streets, but they were too few and poorly armed to pose a serious threat. Anguera de Sojo declared martial law, and the central government sent 2 warships to Barcelona with hundreds of civil guard agents. The general strike of September 1931 resulted in between 6 and 18 workers killed, depending on the source. And over 300 workers suffered what were called governmental arrests, meaning they were detained without charges or judicial process, with sanctions imposed by the governor without the right to appeal. Governmental arrests were one of the most oppressive and despotic practices of the monarchical regime, and people mistakenly believe this will change with the Second Spanish Republic. The rent strike and general strike had a decisive influence on the approval of the so-called Law of Defense of the Republic at the end of October. This law violated constitutional liberties. It allowed governors and police to suspend assemblies and meetings if they believed they threatened public order, banned any strike not reported to the authorities 8 days in advance, and permitted detention without charges and sanctions without a judge's intervention. This was approved under a supposedly left-wing government. As soon as the law was passed, authorities used it to definitively end the rent strike. The COPAP provided men and trucks to the police to increase the number of evictions, and the Law of Defense of the Republic was used to arrest anyone who resisted eviction or was involved in reoccupying apartments. Arresting tenants who reoccupied housing without charges was the most effective measure in breaking solidarity among the strikers. When it became clear that the police could make numerous arrests and monitor evicted apartments, morale broke, and resistance diminished significantly. By December, the Chamber of Landlords was congratulating itself for having ended the rent strike. However, the tenants' strike was not a total failure as it might seem. First, thousands of workers, whether they ended up evicted or not, were able to save several months of rent. This means that, in economic terms, the landlords were the ones who lost out from the strike. And they didn't raise rent prices as a result of the boycott. Second, many landlords, especially the smaller ones, separately agreed to rent reductions and forgave the unpaid months. Moreover, the tenants' strike continued in some suburban areas of Barcelona, such as the public cheap houses in Can Tunis and Ramon Albó, or in La Torrassa in Hospitalet de Llobregat, which were no-go zones for the police and anarchist strongholds. In Barcelona neighborhoods, there were rent non-payments and evictions throughout the 1930s, but these were due to necessity and inability to pay rather than being part of a movement. Meanwhile, landlords represented by the COPAP gained a list of delinquent and evicted tenants that all landlords could consult, keeping it updated with the help of municipal courts. But perhaps the most interesting consequences for the audience are the political ones. The Second Spanish Republic was seen as a historic opportunity to correct the injustices of years of monarchy, with expectations of change fueled by the Republican politicians themselves. The strikers' demands were shared by most workers and were not revolutionary. They simply wanted more reasonable prices in Barcelona's real estate market and an end to abuses, as Esquerra had promised. However, what did the Republicans in power do? They passed a law that violated many articles of the Constitution they had written themselves and put the police at the service of the landlords, just like it happened under the monarchy. This proved once again that anarchists are right. The state is an instrument of minority rule, no matter how nicely it's dressed up as representative democracy. Thus, the repression of the rent strike showed the limits of freedom in the Second Spanish Republic, and that a liberal democracy will always prioritize defending private property over the right to housing. The real estate market in Barcelona was full of illegal practices. Some landlords had gone over 13 years without paying taxes without consequences, and it was common to lie about the size of their properties and the number of tenants. But the state, in the name of legality, protected property owners and allowed employers and landlords to break laws that benefited workers and tenants. The police and justice system only acted against the property-owning class in the most scandalous cases, and never treated them as humiliatingly or with beatings as they did with workers. Justice cannot be equal for all under a state. On the other hand, the Barcelona rent strike of 1931 was the foundation for many later anarchist campaigns. For many, especially the young, it was their introduction to the anarchist movement and in getting used to organizing and solving their own problems without waiting for a politician to do it for them. The police repression against the CNT in the summer and fall of 1931 changed the political balance within the Union. The more moderate faction that believed in working with the Republic lost influence, as their optimistic expectations were shattered by a Republic that kept the same police repression and served the same interests as before. To end on a more positive note, the legacy of the tenants' strike did not end in 1931. In January 1933, for example, the Tenants' Union of Catalonia published a bulletin showing that they made similar demands to the Economic Defense Commission and managed to get a rent reduction for 36 members. In other parts of Spain, there were also smaller-scale tenants' strikes, like in Gijón, Asturias, where the CNT organized a union in the spring of 1932 to enforce the tenant law passed in December. Local groups will go to an evicted house, break the police seal, and reoccupy the home, posting a sign that read, "Open by order of the CNT." Today, there are also tenants' unions, as unity and coordinated action in solidarity among workers remain the most effective tools for the weakest to assert their demands. If you enjoyed today's episode and think it provides valuable lessons for addressing the housing crisis that is happening pretty much worldwide, please hit the like button, comment and share it to help spread this untold story. You can support my work and get exclusive benefits like voting on episode topics or early access at patreon.com/newhistoryspain. Remember to subscribe if you are new to the YouTube channel or podcast New History of Spain, and I invite you to listen to my shorter episode related to this one about the housing crisis in Barcelona in the 1920s and 1930s. The link is in the description. Thank you for your attention and see you soon!